Cult and classic.
Welcome, friends and fiends, to another episode of Cult and Classic Podcast, the podcast where we talk about two thematically linked movies, one mainstream and one cult. I'm your host, comedian and film critic Nate Wyckoff, and as often, I pulled out my headphones just now. There we go, the wonders of electronics. With us, as often, is Tad Mastroianni. How are you doing, Tad?
Hey,
He's Italian, if you can't tell. And also with us as often is Jeffrey Tucker. How you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing great because I'm a man, so I'm allowed to make planes and design planes.
Oh, getting right into it with this one. Yeah, you sound like a pig. And we also have with us Greg Johnson. How you doing, Greg?
Oh, I'm here.
You know what?
That's it.
That's all I can ask. That's all I can ask. That's basically what every employer I've ever had has said. It's like, just please be here. Yeah, so I'm excited for this. We have a Studio Ghibli double shot. Now, there are some of you, I just said that, Studio Ghibli, who just got mad. They just got mad and they're like, it's Studio Ghibli. Here's the deal with this, okay? People asked studio head and founder Hayao Miyazaki, which is the proper pronunciation. And what he said was it was intended to be one, but then they used it in something else and said the other. So basically it's whatever. So I say Studio Ghibli. That's the way it is. Deal with it. You can just tune out every time I say it if it really bugs you, if you don't agree. Now, many of you are saying, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, Nate. You are speaking gibberish. Studio Ghibli is probably the most famous Japanese animation studio. There are, of course, others that are very famous, but Studio Ghibli is sort of it's escaped the bounds of Japanese anime to become an international symbol of excellence in animation, and also specifically excellence in wide audience family films. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some really deep, difficult to watch, tragic things in Studio Ghibli, which we'll get into on this double shot. But first, we're going to talk about the 1980, I believe it's 1985 or 1984, depending on your release date, film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Now, the reason we chose this as the quote mainstream film is because this one is a little more well-known and was known earlier, not just because it's older, but because it got a release early on in the US, which we'll talk about. And then we're going to follow up next weekend with the lesser known film, although it has been since released by Disney, which most Studio Ghibli films have been released by Disney in the United States, uncut, which we will talk about. And that film is Porco Rosso from 1992. Now, very different films, yet very signature Studio Ghibli. And I'm very excited to talk about it because I absolutely love these films. I also want to mention we'll probably be joined, assuming all goes well, by our frequent contributor, Mandy Longley. She'll just be joining us a little late, but she is also a Studio Ghibli aficionado, so it's going to be great to hear her take on these films. All right, so as I usually do, I'm going to ramble through a sort of brief synopsis, summary of the film Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. I'm going to give the spoiler warning. There are spoilers. I don't believe in spoilers, however. Yes, there are some things that are sort of gotcha moments in movies. I recently watched M. Night Shyamalan's new film, Old, and of course his films tend to have one of those. I have nothing against those. I really liked Old. I think they have they're a valid device to use in storytelling. However, most films do not have that element. So when I say spoiler, I'm going to tell you what happens, and we're going to talk about specific things. It's not going to remove your enjoyment of the film if it sounds like your kind of movie. So go watch it. Even if you know the plot, you're still going to be engaged. I promise. And if you disagree, you can write Tad at cultandclassicpodcast@gmail.com.
still waiting for everyone's fucking hate mail. Bring it.
All right. So Nausicaa is it actually is a word from the Odyssey, I believe it's Greek, that means shipbreaker or shipwrecker, something along those lines. And Nausicaa is the name of the princess of the Wind Valley, or the Valley of the Wind, in this created futuristic post-apocalyptic universe. Now, this movie is based off the first 2 volumes of a 27-volume epic manga, which is a Japanese comic that Hayao Miyazaki wrote and illustrated. It is his opus in many ways, and it's evident I think, in this film. I'm just going to say that right away. It's going to be very clear my stance on this movie. I cry every time I watch this movie. It is my favorite of these sort of serious war-themed Studio Ghibli films. Now, people are going to argue with me about that up and down about Princess Mononoke, and they're going to argue, and I'm going to tell them why they're wrong, and that's fine. But the plot is that there's been a massive war that has burnt the earth. And in this now mythologized war, there were 7 giants, which are these big biomechanical machines of some kind that were created by mankind, and they essentially destroyed the world. It's like a stand-in for mutually assured destruction on a nuclear scale, right? Instead of bombs, we have these big giant 7 harbingers of doom that torch the earth. After that, they've been destroyed or died, etc. And what has grown in the wake of these torched earth is 2 things. There are these little villages and what becomes tiny empires of people, as one would expect. And then there are these jungles, these forests of toxicity. Now, they're beautiful forests full of lush flora and fauna, lots of big insects. They're very insect heavy in these forest worlds, and they are toxic to people. They're spores, and the air itself is toxic, so people can only go in there with masks, and if you don't have the mask, you get sick, and eventually it kills you. Now, this wind valley where Nausicaa is the princess has they're close to both an ocean and the edge of one of this toxic forest. So what happens is they sort of have learned to live with the forest, but they do get long-term airborne illnesses that slowly kill them, cause them paralysis, things like that. But they think it's a okay way to live. Well, they're protected because the sea wind protects them from most of the toxicity, and a surrounding forest of trees does the rest of it. Everything's going swell until this big airship crashes in the villagey area, and the only survivor, who dies shortly after crash landing, is the princess of another empire, who says you have to destroy what's in the cargo. Nausicaa says absolutely, and then they find a bug in the cargo, and Nausicaa is sort of the bug whisperer. She has a deep connection with the forest, and she believes in protecting life, so she manages to sort of guide the bug back to the jungle. Well, they assume that's what she meant by burn what's in the cargo, but what it actually is a big egg that turns out to be the last dormant survivor of these big giant killer creatures that torch the earth that mankind created. Well, sure enough, the third and most warlike of the empires that are in this film show up and say, hey, we want that egg back. We stole it from that other place that is now decimated, and you should join us because we're unifying everyone so we can use this big killer monster to destroy the toxic forest so none of us have to live in fear anymore. At the beginning, you'd think on paper that makes a little sense, but this group is pretty vicious, and the first thing they do when landing is kill the king, who is bedridden, which is, of course, Nausicaa's father. She freaks out, shows herself to be incredibly badass, and basically kills the entire entourage in the king's chamber before the sword master, who's on her side, shows up and quells the battle. And she's horrified that she's killed, but she makes a good go of it, and they're taken captive. She tells her people to follow this new crusading empire, because what other choice do you have? They take her captive, but all of a sudden, somebody from that other decimated empire, remember there are 3, there's the first one that got destroyed before we even saw him, there's a second one, which is the warlike one, which has now taken over Nausicaa's village, and then there's Nausicaa's village, the Valley of the Wind. So this one survivor shows up with a gunship and takes out the entire group of this empire's flying machines, and they all survivors land in the middle of the toxic jungle. Well, Nausicaa, of course, goes to save everyone she can, and she ends up meeting I would say he's a love interest, but there's no, I mean, it's a war, and it's appropriate that there really isn't a love story here, and I really appreciate that. But she saves this guy, and they find out that underneath the toxic jungle, the trees have been growing and then dying and basically purifying the toxic environment. So the water there is clean, and the broken down tree material becomes fertile soil. So she finds out that these basically the insects that are very scary and attack people that crash into the forest or kill insects, and this toxic air are all related. The insects are protecting the jungles because they know that the jungles are actually purifying the earth from all this horrible irradiated material that mankind has seeded the topsoil with across the world. But the other empires don't really give a shit about that. All they care about is they want to wipe out these bugs so they don't have to worry about this toxic spreading, and they want to burn down the forests because America. So what happens is this original decimated group that you think might be like sort of in line with Nausicaa because, hey, this warlike empire just took them over. No, they're actually kind of assholes because what they do is they capture a baby ohm, which are the big grub-like shielded insects that are the most dangerous, and they've wounded it and are dragging it through the sky to lead a giant charging mass of enraged ohms to decimate the Valley of the Wind and thus defeat its new captors, the evil empire, essentially. So Nausicaa has to go save this creature and then has to basically convince the Ohm, who are rage insects with red glowing eyes when they're angry. She has to convince them to stop their rampage in time to save her people. And she does this, and it seems to cost her her life. And then, spoiler alert, the Ohms, which are sort of benevolent beings, use their tiny insect tentacles to seemingly heal her, and her village realizes, oh, it wasn't some guy in this prophecy that said they saved the world, it was her. Great. We sort of flip the script on the gender bias prophecy here. It all wraps up really beautifully. The animation is stellar. The story is complicated. And if, for those of you who like it and haven't checked out Nausicaa, the manga, again, this is the first 2 volumes, essentially, give or take. The actual full story is about 27 volumes, although they're thinner volumes. And it ran from 88, actually before that, right? So I can't even remember when it got published, but in the 80s into like 1996, so long after this film was made and completed. But I've talked way too much. It is a story with a lot of heart. It gets very sad. You watch these various groups who are sort of injured do other injurious things to other people because they're injured, and it screams of authenticity because we watch this happen in the world. We do this. It makes you really struggle with being a person, and I identify with that on a spiritual level. So let's dive right in. Mandy, you've joined us. What was your one? I assume you've seen this film before. What was your take watching it this time with an analytical eye, knowing you'd have to talk about it?
Yeah. So this, I believe, was the first Miyazaki film that I ever saw. Like, wait, oh, do I need to turn on my noise thing? How's
Mandy's
that? Is that
very
better?
soft-spoken. Much better.
Yeah. Okay, and it's the end of a long week.
That's true. We're recording this on a Friday, everyone. So if we sound tired, it's because we're tired.
We're tired. Yeah, so this was the first Miyazaki film that I ever saw. Probably about 20 years ago. And I remember really falling in love with his whole storytelling style. And going back and rewatching it this time around, I remember it, like, I guess, like in hindsight, having seen a lot of his other films, like it is softer. Like, it felt softer to me in his storytelling than some of his other ones, like what was it? The one with the wolf girl in it,
Princess Mononoke.
Mononoke. Yeah. So it's like, it feels like a similar story to that, but much softer, although it's still very serious. And I really enjoyed like the soundtrack. Like, it's a very
great
like
soundtrack.
Great soundtrack, but it's very like period. Like, you're like, oh yeah, that was from a certain time.
It's very much. It reminded me, weirdly enough, of I think there's quite a few, but I think I can't remember who did the soundtrack. I apologize, but yes, it's one of those where it reminded me of Charles Band. Like, actually, their music that they do for a lot of full moon productions actually kind of reminded me of this, because it has this faux orchestral but also sort of vaudevillian feel. It's really strange, but it worked 100% for me.
It did, yeah. No, but I just I really loved this, again, just Miyazaki having these strong female characters with a lot of heart and like a moral compass, and just very sweet and genuine. It was really nice to go back to this one.
Yeah, and so it's interesting you say softer, because I think, especially when probably the most well-known in the West Miyazaki movie, Studio Ghibli film, is Spirited Away, which is much more of a family film, or My Neighbor Totoro. And by family film, I mean nothing extremely dangerous or threatening or scary occurs in the films. Maybe a little scary, but it's, you feel safe. The characters are safe. And this one, it's, I think of it sort of as like there's Shakespeare's comedies and there's Shakespeare's tragedies, right? Like his tragedies are very different in vibe than his comedies. We sort of have that with Studio Ghibli. There's less of a divide, but movies like Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind and Princess Mononoke, they have an air of danger, and there's often great sadness, right? Like we watch characters cry in this, characters die, we watch characters cry all the time. There's this big sacrificial arc in it, but he leaves us with frankly a happy ending. And that's something that I don't know if he didn't lose that as he grew older, but I do think that there was a little bit more narcissism coming, not narcissism, fatalism coming in, a little bit more sort of hard-hearted. Hayao Miyazaki is famous for saying anime is trash, which is a great quote for someone who makes some of the best anime in the world. But we understand what he's saying, right? There's a lot of bubblegum or popcorn anime, just like there's a lot of, it's like if you look at something, I'm just picking something out of there, but you would look at Star Wars and then you look at like Cleopatra 2025 or whatever that show was in the early 2000s. You know, it's like there's a difference between something, you know, Star Trek The Next Generation versus Buckaroo Banzai. Like they're very different intent. And this film sort of is an interesting blend. I almost think this film is the strongest blend of Miyazaki's two modes, the family story sweet mode and the problematic human behavior war mode, because this film does have a very strong anti-war sentiment. The lead character, who's the most beautiful, pure of all the creatures, she's capable of violence, but she does everything she can to cause joy and peace. And everyone else around her cannot help but fall into conflict. They are all battling. And we basically have every single side making terrible decisions. Even her own villagers are only sort of saved by the grace of her influence, right? Because she's doing the right thing and the kind thing. She pushes them to do the kind thing, because they say several times, like, why can't I shoot him? That kind of thing. And so I think that that's really interesting to look at in this. And I should say, too, this is actually not a Studio Ghibli movie in the technical sense. This was filmed right before Studio Ghibli was created. So Castle in the Sky was the first Studio Ghibli production. Of course, now it's owned and distributed by Studio Ghibli. So it is most certainly a Studio Ghibli film in cast, crew, all of that stuff and story. But technically, it was created before Studio Ghibli was officially formed. So that's an interesting little note of that. Let's go to Greg. Greg, have you seen this before, and what do you think about it watching it now?
No, I had not. And you referred to this as Miyazaki's magnum opus, and I think that's great if you define magnum opus as a film made specifically for the director with no regards to entertainment value. It's I mean it's the Studio Ghibli film for cinephiles. That's what it is. It's really technically great. There's a lot of like those like wide shots where you're like, oh my god, like that's a fucking painting. Like take that and hang that on my wall. But I kind of found myself a lot of the time I'm watching. Okay, here's a wide panning shot. We're establishing where a character's going. Nausicaa's flying somewhere. Okay. Just found myself waiting, but you know, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it overall. I mean, I waited to look up the voice cast afterward. We're looking at Alison Lohman as Nausicaa. We got Patrick Stewart as Lord Yupa. Uma Thurman's here. Tress MacNeille, Mark Hamill, Edward James Olmos, Shia LaBeouf out of nowhere. Like it was just. I think that really showed. They got some serious voice acting pedigree for. I mean, they always do. But
yeah, since the distributorship has gone through Disney has made an effort to make sure that it has a sort of a star-studded cast, which is interesting because they don't necessarily advertise the cast, much as Robin Williams stayed absent on the Aladdin poster, even though we all knew he was there. It's one of those. This is even more of a guessing game. Every time you listen to a Disney dub release of, which by the way, guys, HBO Max currently, as of this recording, has the full U.S. Disney release of Studio Ghibli's works on HBO Max. So go check that out. You can watch it here. But yeah, it's a nice production. And the first voice that you hear being, well, not the first voice, but one of the first voices being Patrick Stewart is sort of it stopped me in my tracks because I had originally seen this subbed. And so in theaters, which is great because every year, if you guys don't know, every year there's Studio Ghibli hits US theaters in limited releases. And most places around the US have somewhere you could drive through to see them. And they do all the big ones, Nausicaa included. And I agree, this is a film to see in theaters because you do have these grandiose landscapes. The animation is stunning. There's so much hand-painted work. I feel like if I were able to ask Hayao Miyazaki, it'd be interesting, but there's plenty of interviews about this film across the web, but it seems very heavily inspired by like European animation and experimental animation. For example, the ohms, a lot of the time, instead of being fully animated by hand, they're actually moved painted cells. So like the sort of armadillo armor plates on the ohms are actually painted cells that are then moved. And that's a sort of a heavy representation of European animation, especially of the time. And so I think that even heavy metal, like that sort of vibe, I think came with this. And I would say French especially probably played into his view on this. I could be wrong, but if you like the 70s and 80s era of French science fiction animation, of which there is a good amount, then this is probably right up your alley. And that goes for the designs too. We get a lot of sort of fungal, insect, a lot of these usually considered less desirable aspects of nature that are made quite beautiful. And I actually also like, Greg, that you said, if by magnum opus, I mean films the director made for themselves as the main audience. And it's totally true. And I actually do love that hedonistic vibe because I think we get some of our most interesting films when that happens, because when a director or a filmmaker of any kind or an artist of any kind is focused solely on getting their vision out the way they want it, we often get these things that flip the script, that really just do things that we wouldn't otherwise see. And of course, we're all about that here on Cult and Classic Podcast. So I do think that's true, but I think hedonism does play a part in this. And I want to talk a little bit more about the US release of this film, but I'll get to that after we get to Tad and then Jeff. Tad, what was your take watching this film? Did you see it before, and what do you feel seeing it now?
I knew about this movie for years, but we never watched it. My first introduction to Miyazaki stuff was Princess Mononoke, which I found to be I don't think it was that great. And in fact, this movie almost made me think that Mononoke kind of was a rehash of a lot of the themes and even a lot of the artwork of this. I did enjoy this, especially in the way that, I'm a big fan of the Final Fantasy series, and I think a lot of Square's inspiration came from some of Miyazaki's stuff.
Absolutely. You like the chocobos in the beginning?
Yeah, there's some fucking chocobos in this movie. And there's also the absolutely butchered at this point and repeated plot of the planet being in danger and bullshit. I'm playing the Final Fantasy VII remake right now, and it's kind of showing me the same problem that I had with the original Final Fantasy VII that I have with Nausicaa, is that it's true to the source material to an extent, but you realize that when the source material is so large and there's so much story to tell, you end up needing to cut so much stuff. Like I'm pretty sure everyone on this podcast has played the original Final Fantasy VII, right?
I have.
No?
Mandy is not, though, but everyone
Mandy
else has.
Really? Okay. Well, anyway, point is that after
Mandy loses nerd points.
I do not play video games. I play Tetris, which is barely a video game. And
anyway,
that's basically it.
Yeah,
all
she's
right.
a different person than me.
Hey, who knew?
That part is where we diverge.
All right. My point being is that, especially now that I'm older, one of the issues that I had after coming back to the game for so long is that the plot sucks. Like, I'm probably going to piss off some nerds right now, and I don't fucking care. I'm still waiting for my hate mail. but the plot sucks. The plot
It's
is
very
crap.
convoluted in Final Fantasy VII.
It's
There are
convoluted to
two
the point-
stories that they cram together arbitrarily in one.
It's a fucking acid trip with no point. It's like, yeah. And you realize we're realizing that more and more, I think, with art now, is that there are very large stories that people want to tell that they need a long form for it, that they simply didn't have access to back then. Like everything kind of had to be big in your face. We got to cram it all somehow into 2 hours. We don't need to do that anymore. And as a matter of fact, it seems like more artists and studios are getting on board with the idea that they may want to tell stories that stretch out for hours on end. And people are totally down with that, because obviously now we're in the age where if your property is moderately successful, you will get a goddamn TV show, and you may get multiple seasons depending on how many few million people tune in, because at this point the human race is so fucking populated that all you got to do is please a few million people and you can rake in cash. So
look, you don't have to hate on Fast and Furious 9. That's not fair.
I can't. I just find it hard to believe that Fast and Furious has almost as many sequels as Star Trek and Star Wars at this point.
It's all about family.
Yeah. God.
So I think you're validated on the fact that this is a complicated plot. In fact, I've seen it several times, and now, of course, I know the plot without thinking about it. But at the time, I remembered being like, if this was a book, it would be easier to remember the names of these people. I still don't remember the names of the empires or the individuals aside from Nausicaa. But it's interesting because. Well, let's get to you, Jeff, and then I'll give my 2 cents and some backstory, some interesting facts about the releases of this film. Jeff, had you seen this before? I believe you have, and now that you watched it again, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, of course I've seen this before. I own all of Miyazaki's films. I am a Miyazaki shill.
I'm just gonna say, you need to speak louder. You and your sister are the loudest people I know in my life, and both of you have been suspiciously quiet.
Yeah, this is kind of weird.
I will say that, and it's probably too much information, but this week being a long week, as I mentioned, part of it was actually cleaning out my ears, so I can actually hear better this week.
So you can hear.
So well, I'm not talking so loud, which is why I'm basically like an old person. Like I'm always shouting because I can't hear myself.
I'm pretty sure I have a second pair of earbuds beneath these earbuds
like
right
inside
now.
The earbuds, yeah.
It's weird because I never changed my volume on my thing. So is that better?
Yeah.
Much better.
All right. So yes, of course I've seen it. I own all of Miyazaki's films. I am a endless shill for Miyazaki. We
love you for it.
I love his style. And I think the thing about this particular film that sets it out from the other films is it's actually older than I am. And the art style is kind of that 80s style, and I really do love all of the art styles from all of his films, but this one's very different, and I kind of love that kind of like surrealistic, kind of like the masks just look weird. They're like this kind of like breather thing with like some kind of like ears flopping out from the sides. It looks weird, but it sets like a kind of like a tone and like a feeling that goes through the whole film, where every frame is really interesting and full of things that you're like, well, what's that? That's not from my universe. And I love that type of thing because you can really rewatch it over and over again, almost with the sound off, and just enjoy the film. But everybody's right here. This film is actually the most complex and kind of convoluted of all of his films. He does this actually, almost throughout almost all of his films, especially the ones that Nate was talking about. There's like a lot of stuff happening outside of the main characters. There's like a lot of breadth to it, kind of like if you're reading a book but you're like missing like a couple chapters. And in this case, there's like made up places with made up people in them, and it's really hard to follow and track. But having said that, the general thread of like how he generates a narrative, he doesn't create a villain. Like there's people that are assholes in the film, but their downfall is not like the structure of where the film is going. usually there's some sort of man not balanced with nature, and you know, it's really the realization of that, and the you know, the conclusion of that balance that is the end of the narrative. The you know, the climactic moment in this film is, you know, Nausicaa essentially, you know, sacrificing herself for a baby bug creature, in you know, in hopes to, you know, calm down the bugs. Because here's the, like, the basically the, you know, the moral of all of Miyazaki's stories is, like, when you let hate take the lead, you start making like bad decisions. You start kind of like this shoot first, ask questions never kind of mentality, and you just perpetuate that same cycle over and over and over again, and it's just destruction, you know, until there's nothing left. And it's crazy that he's making, you know, animated films, you know, for, you know, the family, that have such a heavy token. But I think that that's his craft as a filmmaker. He's able to distill these ideas down and put them, basically these great characters at the lead. So you're really following a character. You're following Nausicaa, and you love Nausicaa because she's selfless, she's caring, she's like all of those great characteristics of your hero. And, you know, that character essentially, you know, guides you through this horrible world, to safety, to the end, where you get that lovely, you know, positive ending in this case.
And I agree with everything that you said. And Tad, to get sort of what you were thinking, so this, I get that very much with this film, is that people see Princess Mononoke first because it was, before Spirited Away, it was the Miyazaki film that got the wide release that everybody saw. And a big part of that, a reason why I think a lot of people sort of saw it and were like, oh, this is amazing, is because Neil Gaiman did the English adaptation script for it. And so all the Sandman and Neil Gaiman fans like myself saw it. And I liked Princess Mononoke, but I will actually say it is my least favorite Miyazaki film. And it's partly because I feel like Nausicaa is a much more complex version of it, and I feel like Mononoke is the much more accessible and incredibly beautifully animated as well, using a lot more modern techniques. So it's like, this is, as Jeff said, this is a very classic 80s style technique where everything is beautiful. There's a lot of painted work, painstaking, and then, not that there isn't a lot of work and painstaking detail in Princess Mononoke, but they use a lot of
I would describe it as kinetic.
Yes,
Mononoke is very kinetic. Everything is moving, and they're interacting with each other.
There's
in
bits
this
and
really...
blood and scales and feathers flying everywhere. Or, I mean, fur. Like, it's very much that. And it is much simpler. It takes the idea, and for me, I found it a little too on the nose in a way. And actually, I found that Princess Mononoke felt a little bit mean-spirited is not the right word. But if Nausicaa is a tale of caution and like, be wary of hate and single-mindedness and look at the world as a whole and other people in the context of what they've experienced, then Princess Mononoke is sort of an accusation. You're making a mistake. You're wrong. You're doing this incorrectly. You're hurting other people. Like, it feels a little bit more angry, maybe a tiny bit of desperation. And what I love about Nausicaa, and you said this, Jeff, when you said there's no villain. It's that every character, and Miyazaki, as you said, does this all the time, every villain, quote unquote, character has a backstory that is, one, not given an obnoxious exposition. It's beautifully worked into just the amount of detail that you need into the story. But you can kind of be like, I kind of get where they're coming from. Like, the leader of the warlike empire, she has this, who I think was Uma Thurman voiced her. She has this line where she takes off her left gauntlet, and you see that she basically has some sort of robotic arm. She's missing her arm, and she has a great line in the translation, which is, whoever becomes my husband's going to see a lot worse than that. And it's these little moments where that's all you really needed to be like, oh, I get it. She's been hurt to the point where she no longer sees grayscale. She sees black and white, right, wrong, this or that. So it informs all of her decisions. Whereas Nausicaa has seen and had horrible things inflicted on her in this film. You know, her father's killed early on in cold blood, and yet she maintains her humanity and views all the characters from this sort of higher level place where everybody has value. And what I love about movies like this, and Miyazaki's a master of this, is that when you see everybody's mistakes from that higher level where it's a holistic view and you can kind of understand where they're coming from, even if you think they're wrong, it's the way that shows people when they're wrong, even if they don't see that right away in themselves. You know, you could show someone who is sort of the leader of you know, a terrorist organization who's lost their family at a young age and thinks that what they're doing is right. You could show them a film like this and they would understand that the quote unquote bad guys are doing the wrong thing. And it's just that next step then that it's on the person watching to say, am I like that? How am I like that? And that's the sort of thing. And it's this really beautiful, and children, I think, get that message a lot better than adults sometimes, because we assume we're right. Children are told always that they're wrong. So this is the kind of thing that really can help people see what they should be doing and the importance of kindness and caring for other people.
Yeah, and forgiveness, and like people are, you know, people make mistakes and they get led down the wrong path. And you know, like in this particular movie, you know, the Mark Hamill coming, you know, he always voices a jerk in Miyazaki films for some reason.
Yes, he does.
Well, like he's probably the jerkiest of all the jerks, but you get like that, you know, he's just trying to protect his people. You know, he says like, you know, what are we supposed to do? Just like, you know, surrender and like, you know, become servants of this other group. And you're like, yeah, you're wrong, but like I get that you're just trying to protect your people. You're doing it absolutely horribly, and hopefully you know, everybody can see like, yeah, the war is evil and this guy is you know, full on wrong for going into it. But he's still like, you can see in that very just brief amount, you can see how he got there. Like you see the path to how, you know, he was, you know, a decent person just looking out for his people, and then he became he went down the wrong path into warring and doing horrible fucking things.
For sure. And this is a good time to get into sort of the distribution history of this film. So this film was actually released in the US by New World Cinema. And here's the thing. So New World Cinema has made some of my favorite bad movies. But what happened is they got this film and they cut about 25 minutes of it, changed dialogue, and they released it in 1985. And they released it as Warriors of the Wind. Now you can find this cut sort of floating around in places. It's very poor color. It is what it is. But what they did is that they removed all subtext and all heavy elements to make it a straight action adventure. And then when they released the promos and everything, Nausicaa wasn't even the lead on. They moved other characters that looked cool, quote unquote, to the front and put all the female characters in the back. Needless to say, Hayao Miyazaki was horrified, and he actually didn't distribute any movies in the US because of this, for the most part, until Princess Mononoke was the next big release. And that, of course, had the stipulation that nothing be cut. It'd be a straight translation. There are no changes. Now, Harvey Weinstein, human trash, as we all know him to be, was at this time still a big movie mogul, and he wanted to release Princess Mononoke. And so he was working back and forth, his people, with Studio Ghibli, and Hayao Miyazaki said, it can't be cut. And Harvey Weinstein said, actually, it has to be cut, and we're going to cut it, and it's going to be more like Warriors of the Wind. To which Hayao Miyazaki basically, and probably not even basically, he's a very direct person, said, fuck you, I'd rather it burn in hell. And Harvey Weinstein got angry because he is human trash, and said, fired off a thing saying, you will never release a film in the United States. You know, you just burnt your bridge or whatever. And now Harvey Weinstein is hopefully in really poor health and dying, and a piece of garbage. And Hayao Miyazaki is one of the most revered filmmakers of all time. So stick to your guns, do what's right, and when you meet someone like Harvey Weinstein, kick him in the balls, because he really shouldn't reproduce. If he has children, which I think he does, they could be wonderful people. I'm not holding it against them, but why take the chance? Kick him in the balls, solve the problem. That's my crudeness for this episode. But anyway, so Disney has been very respectful, apparently, and has released great translations of the films. Now, I will say, I actually find, as a side note, some of the celebrity voices, they do a great job. Obviously, I adore Jean-Luc Picard, and Patrick Stewart's just amazing across the board. I do find it to take me out occasionally. Like, we'll talk about the next film, Porco Rosso. Michael Keaton does the voice of Porco Rosso. He does a great job. Everyone does a really good job, but it's a little too much for me for some reason. It makes me think of other things while I just want to watch the film. And this is me going on my crusade again, and not just because I am a voice actor on occasion, but because I want voice acting to be taken seriously as an art form as well as acting. So if you're amazing on screen, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should just get a place behind the microphone. There are amazing people, Frank Oz, etc., who have much better, stronger careers behind the microphone, because they can do things that screen or stage actors, they can't do, because they're only using part of their skill set. They're not using the physical, visual skill set. So that's just something to think of. I think a good example is the My Neighbor Totoro Disney release dub. It's very good, but the original, I believe it's Fox Searchlight or Fox release of My Neighbor Totoro, with a lot of the Rugrats cast doing the voice, is even better. So let's just keep that in mind, people, as we're having our movies cast. Of course, a big part of it too is if you get a theater release, you want some acting clout behind there that people will recognize. But let's try and break that trend. So we're going to move to recommendations. We're going to do this fast so we can get you guys to your day. And then next week, we'll bring you the next episode of this. Greg, would you recommend Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind? And if so, why?
I mean, I would recommend any Studio Ghibli film. It's kind of not hard to. But I like Princess Mononoke more. I've always liked it more. Even after seeing this, I appreciate what you said, Jeff, about Miyazaki villains kind of not being villains, but a little more sympathetic. But I think Nausicaa, especially, all of his villains kind of have this sense of them where they're like, hey, it's nothing personal, but I'm going to kill all your people. And you're like, well, like, at what point do you cross the threshold? And how did we get to a point where Cruella has this origin film where her parents are killed by Dalmatians, and we're trying to find ways to relate to villains? And
by the way, guys, if you haven't seen Cruella, that actually happens in the movie.
So enjoy that when you watch it. But I think Nausicaa has some people. I'm like, you know what? I want to see a little Princess Mononoke where the villain, we see this they have this big battle, and we see that they've murdered all these living pigs, like these sentient gods, demons, whatever they were, and like it's a massacre. Versus in this, it's all off camera that they committed genocide on this group of people when there's maybe
the original series Star Wars did.
Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, my recommendation would be, yes, it is a good Studio Ghibli film. It's a little more for the film buff, I think. I'd say check out Princess Mononoke first. If the idea of an apocalypse film is a little too dark for you, go watch WALL-E instead. That's a light one. So yeah.
And you get a happy cockroach
with barely any dialogue ever.
Yeah, that's right. Tad.
Sorry. I did want to just add that also I really appreciate, especially coming off of thinking about the Last of Us, and like the second one that got some rebuke for daring to show a woman with biceps. I appreciate that. Nausicaa has broader shoulders and some clear muscles, and you know what, everything turned out okay at the end of the film.
That's right.
Was okay.
Not only
everything's
she's not
fine,
sexualized, but she's sort of amazing.
So yeah, I appreciated character design in this film.
Nailed it.
I don't know exactly how she was going to be able to fly around on a glider without having some fucking pipes.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. She's holding herself up. By the way, that glider is amazing design. All the other gliders are not as good as that. Tad, would you recommend Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind? And if so, why?
Honestly, No. And mainly because I think I would honestly recommend that people just read the manga instead, because the story is far more complete and has a lot more, you get more of the world building. Like, this movie wants to cram as much of that world building as possible, and Miyazaki's fantastic at that. However, Miyazaki crammed a lot of world building into a very small ball, and frankly, this probably would have been better if he could have, I don't know, made it into a 2-3 parter. That way he could have told the story better. I felt like there was just too much crammed into it, and I couldn't get fully into it. And that's not to say that I did not appreciate the soundtrack, the art, the characters.
A lot of the soundtrack, by the way, was modified Handel, so it's sort of classic with some new stuff in there.
It's all the elements were there, but again, like I was talking about before, the story just was missing so many things that I had a really hard time pulling it all together. And thankfully, because I've watched enough anime and played enough video games, my brain was able to kind of piece together the plot, because I went, oh, I know what's going to happen now. So read the manga instead.
Sure. And I mean, I think a second viewing of this film helps, because that's when I actually got a handle of who did what sometimes, especially when they're just telling me as opposed to me seeing it. But yeah, I think it's also, this is a 2-hour movie, which at the time of release was pretty long, especially for an animated feature, which is why it was cut down so much in the US release. Well, one of the reasons. Also, the US sentiments in it are not the best for you know, US mindset with military doesn't come out well in Studio Ghibli films. Let's just say that. Yeah, so interesting take. Jeff, would you recommend Studio Ghibli's Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind?
I would very much so suggest it. I actually, because I disagree. I do think it's very complicated, but it does provide something that the manga's not. It's a little bit easier to get into. It is going to be hard to get everything out that you need to. So go watch this and then be inspired to go finish reading the manga if you wanted more. And just a final comment. So the reason I think, now I haven't seen Cruella and I'm not going to make a comment on that, but so the reason it's interesting when movies actually draw a clear pathway from a normal person that's just a mayor of a city to this guy that thinks there's no other options but to do this horrible thing to protect his people. The reason that's interesting is because it creates a pathway to see this. You go from this point, and then you just keep delving more into this us or them mentality, and that I think is interesting because it's a pathway to say don't go down there. It's it's the cautionary tale. It's the hey, this type of thinking is not, you're not immune to it. You're a person, and you can easily go down these essentially traps of thought. If it were, your family that's, you're up against the wall, are you going to fight back? Probably. And so it's just, it's easy to get it at a mentality and to draw that line in art. It allows people to see that and be like, I don't want to go down that path. That's not the right path for me. I don't want to be the villain at the end of the day.
I agree. And I think Miyazaki would be very happy to see that line being connected by the viewer, especially since the thread is so strong in all of his quote unquote serious films and war themed films. Mandy, before me, you're last on the docket. Would you recommend Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind? And if so, why?
I would. If you find yourself wanting to go to a lot of environmental protests, you're very fired up about, we all should be, about the health of our earth and climate change and how humans affect our world around us. But it is pretty heavy. Like I mentioned, it is softer, and I think we talked about that a bit, how it's a little bit softer, has a happier ending than Princess Mononoke. But I mean, that's if I was gonna recommend a top 5 Miyazaki films, this wouldn't be in it. But it is obviously still beautiful and wonderful and worth your time if you want to go down that rabbit hole.
Why would you only watch the top 5 Miyazaki films? You watch all of them once a month.
You watch the top 5 because then the person's going to want to watch the others.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, it's a beautiful movie. We already talked about the themes. If it sounds like it'd be interesting to you, watch it. Just do it.
Yeah, I think for me personally, this is my favorite Studio Ghibli film. So it would be my number one. And then for probably the more fun, family friendly, My Neighbor Totoro would be, especially the Fox dub, but any of them would be my number two. But there are plenty of reasons to watch any number of Miyazaki's films, and not just Miyazaki's films. Studio Ghibli has other people within its family that make wonderful films. The Cat Returns is one of my favorites. It's sort of a pseudo sequel to Whispers of the Heart. Anyway, there's so many. You can't go wrong, whether they're the ones released by Disney or any other venue. Check them out. I really recommend them. I think Nausicaa is beautiful, and especially if you're like me and you love that heavy metal 70s Fantastic Planet kind of vibe to your animated films, this is really going to scratch that itch in a way that so many films almost do but miss. So that is us for today, talking about not Princess, well, she is Princess, but Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. And we will be back next week with 1982's Porco Rosso, which is a very different Studio Ghibli film, but very exciting to talk about as well. Join us then. Write us online at cultandclassicpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Cult and Classic Podcast. Send Tad your hate mail. And to play us out, as always, is Just Kidding, leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And to play us out, as always, is the Chud with All About Evil.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Cult and Classic Podcast. This podcast is important to me, but what's more important are the rights, privileges, and freedom from violence of everyone in this country and in this world. And that means supporting Black Lives Matter. If you'd like to make a donation, please go ahead and visit cultandclassicpodcast.com, where we have a list of places you can donate and help out. And please stay safe.